Thank you very much, Michael, and thank you to Robert for giving me the great honour of asking me to speak with you today. It's a particular honour, as those of you who did hear me speak in New South Wales will have heard that my earliest association with the Red Cross was none too glorious. It occurred on my first Christmas Day when I was 6 months old, and it was a particularly hot day spent at the home of my great uncle, who was at that stage the New South Wales State Director of the Red Cross. I was sitting on my mother's lap in the middle of lunch, and there was a glass of white wine in front of her. I was thirsty. I'd never drunk from a cup before, but I discovered that I could and consumed the glass of wine. This then became the stuff of family stories for many years to come. My mother's version always included her consternation that I had behaved such a way in the exalted company. My father's version of the story always focused on the fact that I had slept peacefully for the rest of the afternoon. I'm glad to say that I didn't go on to a life of insobriety after that inglorious start. And as I progressed through my early life, I established more connections with the Red Cross. First in primary school, where I got and wore with pride my little Red Cross badge, which I still have. And then as soon as I was able, I got another badge, that of the blood donor. Then much further down the track, the Red Cross's telecross service supported my family in granting my father's wish that he remain in his own home despite his increasing infirmity and failing eyesight, as it supplemented our family contact, and it gave us great peace of mind to know that he was able to be safely there. It's been in my professional life, however, that I've had most to do with Red Cross over the years. For over 15 years, I was in Geneva once or twice a year at meetings of the Executive Committee of the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees. And in all of these meetings, the Federation and ICRC could be counted upon to make constructive and principled contributions. Then, whenever I went into the field to visit refugee camps, I knew I would see either a Red Cross or Red Crescent symbol, no matter how remote or how precarious the location. Back in Australia, the staff of the Red Cross were valued colleagues, many of whom I now count as close friends, and the agency was reliably a useful collaborator in policy advocacy. As the years went by, I frequently encountered the tangible results of the Red Cross's work. None touched me quite as profoundly as the case of Pascal and Maria, who I first met in 2008 when I was conducting research in regional Victoria for the Department of Immigration. My arrival in the town coincided with great celebrations surrounding Maria's arrival. Maria is Pascal's daughter, and at that time she was 10 years old. Pascal and his family came from the Democratic Republic of Congo, one of the most dangerous places on earth, a country in which there have been over 5 million conflict-related deaths in the last decade, and a recent major flare-up in the east of the country. This family, however, were forced to flee at another time, in 2001, when militias from Rwanda swept through the regional city in which they were living and forced its residents out at gunpoint. With thousands of others, they journeyed on foot towards Tanzania. En route, the refugees were attacked many times. On one occasion, Pascal was held down and forced to watch his wife violently attacked. Her wounds were so severe that she died within days, leaving Pascal and his 4 children, including 5-year-old Maria and her twin sister. Then came another attack, and the family ran for their lives. When the militias retreated, Pascal gathered his children together, but Maria was nowhere to be found. He searched and searched and searched, but couldn't find her. Distraught, the family continued walking until they reached the relative safety of a refugee camp in Tanzania, and 4 years later, Pascal and his 3 remaining children were accepted for resettlement to Australia. When they arrived, the children were enrolled in a local Catholic school, and while doing the usual getting to know the family routine, the headmistress heard the story of their flight and of what had happened to Maria and decided to take up the quest of finding her. She contacted the Red Cross, and tenaciously and relentlessly she worked with them and with the tracing team, supporting them in every way she could, as they collectively followed lead after lead, dead end after dead end. And then eventually they found Maria in a refugee camp in northern Kenya. When the militias had attacked, Maria had become separated from the family and spent several days wandering alone amidst the tide of humanity. Quite by chance, she came across her 12-year-old uncle, who also was alone. The 2 of them clung together through thick and thin, and finally, thanks to the Red Cross, were able to join Pascal in Australia. When I first saw her, Maria had only just arrived. She was very thin and a good head shorter than her identical twin sister. Now you can't tell the 2 apart, and all the children are thriving. Pascal is also doing remarkably well, nearing completion of qualifications in community welfare and actively involved in the local soccer team. I recall a slogan on a Refugee Week banner a few years back. Let Australia mean hope for refugees. Let refugees mean hope for Australia. As far as I'm concerned, Pascal and his little family embody every element of this slogan. I have to confess, however, that when I tell this story, I wonder whether there are people out there who might be thinking, but they're the good refugees. They waited in a queue. What about the other ones who come by boat? Surely they don't deserve the help that they've been getting. And I wonder, by extension, whether there's anybody who might be who've been sitting here listening to the reports about what the Red Cross has been doing and wondering, why are we helping these people, the ones that come by boat? Aren't they coming illegally? If you listen to the press, you'll be entirely forgiven for thinking this way and wondering what on earth the Red Cross is doing. Not for the first time, however, the press and many politicians have been playing hard and loose with the facts and distorting the true picture in order to score points or gain political advantage. Before I get on to why the Red Cross is and should be working with these asylum seekers, it's possibly worthwhile putting a few facts on the table to counter some of the misinformation. The best place to begin is with the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, the foundation document of all international human rights law. Article 14.1 of the Universal Declaration states, everyone has the right to seek and enjoy in other countries asylum from persecution. Then we can turn to the Refugee Convention, the international treaty that Australia was instrumental in drafting and bringing into effect. Remember that fact. It's relevant for what I have to say later. The Refugee Convention both obliges countries to offer protection to people seeking asylum until such time as it's determined that they are not entitled to the protection afforded by refugee status. And it explicitly states that countries should not impose penalties if a refugee arrives or is in the territory without authorisation. All of the brouhaha around illegals is really quite wicked. It is falsely assigning criminality to people who are simply exercising a fundamental human right, and it creates a fictional construct of legitimate versus illegitimate refugees. Then there's the issue of queue jumping. Like the term illegals, the suggestion of jumping a queue is something that really inflames passions in our society. There is something quite visceral in people's responses to this term. Everyone's been in front of them in traffic or leaping ahead of them in a queue in the supermarket. The repeated use of this term in the public discourse means that the annoyance one feels on such occasions is subliminally linked to refugees and to asylum seekers. Those who thought of the use of the term queue jumpers in relation to asylum seekers were very clever indeed. They recognised that the aversion to anyone who jumps a queue would feed into deeply held values of fairness, and this in turn would play on the notion that Australia is the land of the fair go. The behaviour is thus perceived of as being un-Australian, and of course we don't want people like that in our country. But what is the that? Have these people transgressed? Are their values different to our own? The other very clever thing about the use of the term queue jumping is that it takes but a second for the word to enter our subconscious and to offend our values. But it takes much longer to unpack the issues. I find that using analogies can be a very useful way to do this, so I'll use a couple. In our health system, it's accepted that there are two equally legitimate ways of being admitted to hospital. The first, the elective surgery route, is for people deemed stable enough to be able to wait in a queue. The bean counters like this route, as they can make plans and do budget forecasts. It's all very nice and neat. The second entry port is through the emergency section of the hospital. This is the route for people whose life is in danger and or who need immediate attention. It's much the same with refugees. Some are in situations overseas where it is possible for them to wait. Not forever, but for a while at least. They are the targets of Australia's offshore humanitarian program, and like the equivalent elective surgery route, planners and bean counters like this group very much, as they are the ones who are in control. There are, however, other refugees for whom waiting in another country is far too dangerous, or they have waited and waited and waited and see no viable future other than to take things into their own hands. These are the ones who turn to smugglers to facilitate their passage to safety through the equivalent of the emergency department of a hospital. And just as it is expected that a hospital should be able to cope with large-scale emergencies such as a train crash, so too should we be able to cope with the fluctuation of numbers of asylum seekers arriving by boat. So it's not a case of queue jumping, but rather coming through an equally legitimate doorway. But then we come to the vexed question of money. These people have paid smugglers to get them here, so surely they can't be legitimate refugees. For a start, the Refugee Convention is silent on money. There is no requirement that you must be poor in order to be a refugee. In fact, quite the contrary is often the case. It is people of status and privilege within a country, lawyers, doctors, scientists, and academics, who are often the ones who fall foul of an oppressive regime and are forced to flee. Maybe I can use another hospital analogy here. A couple of years ago, I was diagnosed with kidney cancer. My surgeon gave me two options. I could wait around for an indeterminate period of time to get a bed in a public hospital, or I could use my private health insurance and go in a very rapid pace of time into a private hospital for the surgery. No prizes for guessing which route I took. And not a single person turned to me and said, "You were queue jumping." In fact, I like to think of it that by going into a private hospital, somebody got into the public hospital a little bit sooner because I wasn't in that bed. So where does that leave us? Rather than illegals and queue jumpers, we have people who are exercising their legitimate right to seek protection in our country. One other issue worthy of addressing before moving on is the question of numbers. Here too, let me put a couple of facts on the table. According to United Nations figures, in 2011, only 2% of those seeking protection in Western states came to Australia. That's about 11,500 people. If you took all of those 11,500 people and multiplied them 8 times, you still wouldn't have filled all of the seats in the Melbourne Cricket Ground. In the same year, Canada, which is the country to which we most often compare ourselves in migration and other matters, Canada was the destination of 8% of the world's asylum seekers. That's 4 times the number that came here. So are we really being swamped? Another fact worth considering is that of those who came to Australia by boat, the great majority will be found to have legitimate protection-related claims. Traditionally, the acceptance rate for the major caseloads of boat arrivals has been in the order of 95%. These people are not abusing a system, but seeking from it that for which it was set up: protection. And then there is a small minority who are not found to be refugees, and these people are removed, as they should be, sent back to their countries of origin. Then before we move away from numbers, let's come back to the thorny issue of queues. If there were no new conflicts in the world, at the current rate it would take 123 years to resettle the world's refugees. The prospect of such a wait would challenge even the most ardent adherent to the quaint Anglo-Saxon notion of queuing. It's important to recognise that it's important that Australians recognise that the public discourse around asylum seekers, and by extension refugees, is based on misinformation and manipulation. Much of this has been generated by politicians of all persuasions, who by creating the notion of a threat believe that they could win the public's gratitude by protecting them against this threat. There are, of course, many problems with this approach, as we've seen all too clearly. The obsession with border protection has not been matched with an equivalent focus on people protection. Hundreds of millions of dollars have been spent trying to keep people out, and only a fraction of this on initiatives that address the very real threats that people face in countries of first asylum and in the countries immediately to our north. So desperate people continue to risk their lives looking for a place where they can finally be safe. And politicians, having failed over decades to invest in the things that could really make a difference, and having sold the line to the public that the boats must be stopped at all costs, are backed into a situation where they feel compelled to take more and more radical steps to demonstrate to the public that they are in control. Rather than achieving this objective, however, I would argue that control has been lost. To me, control is about developing public policy that is both legally and ethically defensible. Instead, in recent months, we have seen, amongst other things, Australia export its responsibility for refugee protection to our impecunious and ill-equipped neighbours, and excise the entire mainland of Australia from the migration zone. Policies have also been introduced that will commit thousands of refugees to indefinite periods in a Godot-like existence, a life of limbo without certainty about the future, and in many cases without the right to work. Despite the fact that this is in direct violation of international law and will most definitely, according to very ample evidence, cause lasting damage to people who did nothing more than to turn to us and ask for our help. And just as an aside, I heard yesterday that in that last year there were 1,100 serious incidents of self-harm in our immigration detention centres. It's not an exaggeration to say that the situation we face is very grave. And it's not just for the people directly affected by these policies. What is playing out here constitutes a serious threat to the international protection regime. If all 148 signatory states to the Refugee Convention chose to follow Australia's example, the entire refugee protection system would collapse. And what's to guarantee that they wouldn't choose to follow our example? After all, we are one of the most economically successful and politically stable countries on earth. If we say we can't cope, we open the door wide for other countries to say they can't cope either. And what will be the result? In addition to the immense human suffering this would cause, we would lose the very tool that enables governments to manage irregular migration in an orderly way, the Refugee Convention. At this point, I could be like Hanrahan and say, we'll all be ruined. But despite, or maybe because of, the many years I've had working in the refugee sector, I remain an optimist. I genuinely believe that we live in a good country populated by people who want to do the right thing. Shifting the public debate will not be easy, nor will it be easy to shift the political discourse. But both are worthy objectives, and there are many people working towards these very goals. And this brings me back to the Red Cross. As you well know, the Red Cross is not out there manning the barricades or waving placards in the street. But it doesn't mean it's not playing a vital role in Australia in defence of refugees and asylum seekers. It works quietly, more often than not behind closed doors, to present a principled view on public policy underpinned by the Red Cross principles. Since the early 1990s, as you've heard, the Red Cross has led the way in the provision of services to asylum seekers who arrive by plane and are thus enabled to reside in the community until the decision is made on whether or not they are entitled to protection in this country. More recently, the Red Cross has greatly expanded its work in this area to include asylum seekers who've arrived by boat and have been released from detention pending a resolution of their status. This work has, as you've heard, been ramped up almost exponentially, and there are currently some 6,000 asylum seekers receiving this support. And at this point, I'd like to commend Noel and Liz and the team around Australia who have been doing an exceptional job in very difficult circumstances doing this work. But why is the Red Cross doing this? Why has it taken on this challenge? For a start, it is entirely consistent with the international movement's fundamental principles of humanity and impartiality. Asylum seekers are arguably some of the most vulnerable people in this country. They're in a strange country far from home, quite literally placing their lives in the hands of strangers. Ensuring they are treated fairly and with dignity and in accordance with the law is, without doubt, a humanitarian response, in so much it is intended to, and here I quote from the Red Cross's fundamental principles, it is intended to prevent and alleviate human suffering wherever it may be found, and to protect life and health, and to ensure respect for the human being. When it comes to impartiality, the movement seeks to, and here again I quote, relieve the suffering of individuals being guided solely by their needs and to give priority to the most urgent cases of distress. In so doing, it does not play politics or take sides, save possibly the side of the most vulnerable, seeking to use humanitarian principle to inform the development of policy and legislation and to promote respect for the rule of law. The Australian Red Cross's work with asylum seekers is also an appropriate response to the most recent affirmation of the movement's commitment to population displacement, Resolution 3 of the November 2011 Council of Delegates, which called on all components of the movement, including national societies such as our own, to, amongst other things, strengthen cooperation in addressing the needs of vulnerable migrants. Moving from the international to the domestic, the Australian Red Cross has identified, as you know, 7 priority areas for its programs, one of which is addressing the impact of migration. This covers many areas, including the tracing work that restored Maria to her family, but it also covers the provision of humanitarian support to people while their immigration status is being resolved. I guess that explains the mandate, and mandates are very important for organisations. They legitimise and guide the work being undertaken. For me, however, there is something else going on here that can't be captured in business jargon or legalese. I'm not quite sure what the right word for this extra dimension is. Maybe it's soul. I know that it's something that's very important for me, and it was a big part of why I was very pleased to accept the invitation to join the board. Having observed the Red Cross for most of my life and having worked alongside it for over 25 years, it is my view that it is an organisation that has soul. Defining just what this is rather hard, so maybe here I can turn to a fable I heard a number of years ago. It involves a teacher sitting under a tree surrounded by his students. How, asked the teacher, can one tell when night turns into day? Keen to please their teacher, the students offered many suggestions. Please, master, said one, is it when the first cock crows? No, said the teacher. Another suggested that it might be when the last star fades. Another when the first rays of the sun hit the distant mountain tops. After each of these suggestions, the teacher shook his head. Eventually the students said, how is it that we know when night turns into day? Listen carefully, said the teacher, for this is the most important lesson I can teach you. Night turns into day when you recognise that the stranger walking towards you is your brother. Thank you.